Okay, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and start on Lecture 16. Just to let you know, we've had a couple of really good questions. First off, as you know, you do get to drop the lowest exam, but you still have to try the final. Okay, so the reason is because you do need to know the information, especially if you go into 172 or biology. Okay, and so I want you to at least read through it, attempt it, and do your best. And then, yes, if that's a low score, you can go ahead and drop that one. But what I don't want to see happen is have you guys all of a sudden disappear on me. Okay, so I am keeping track of how many of you watch the lectures, and I know, how to make sure everybody's paying attention and so forth. And so please do attempt the final exam at least, and definitely listen to the lectures, because remember, you've got to have this information for your upper level bio courses, okay? That was the first good question I had. If there was a second one as well, hopefully I'll remember that soon. So what we'll focus on today, oh, I remember the second question. I do have more lectures than the ones that are posted, okay? But I did not upload them all yet, but I will. All right, so don't worry, plenty of material to go over. You guys won't be bored, okay? So we still have a lot of good stuff to talk about. All right, so today for Lecture 16, we're going to focus on niches or niches, however you prefer to pronounce that, competition, mutualisms, and all sorts of other good stuff. So the first thing we have to address, though, is what is an ecological niche or niche, and it just depends on how you want to pronounce it, okay? So basically, you can quantify this and visualize it if you plot it along a series of axes. Okay, it can have many dimensions. Your niche is basically your ecological space, okay? So what temperatures you can live in, precipitation, the food you eat, the species you interact with, and, the individuals you interact with, who do you compete with, who do you have a mutualistic relationship with, all that other good stuff. Okay, so we tend to use, plots to be able to visualize it, but the reality is, it's sort of this n-dimensional hyperspace thing where it's all the different critters and resources that you happen to interact with. Now, as we know that there are all sorts of different species and critters that interact with one another, okay, and so if you happen to have niches or niches overlap, you might be wondering where would the strongest competition be. Okay, and so I just realized the program one slide ago, there was supposed to be a picture of a finch, okay, and that collaborates or connects to this particular figure. Finches of different beak sizes, okay, will then go after seeds of different sizes, okay, and so species 1 goes after seeds, in that particular size, species 2, and so forth. So given this information, where would you expect to see the strongest competition between species? Remember, competition is a negative relationship. Take a moment, think about it, and address the question, and then once you're ready, go ahead and start lecture up again. So where niches overlap, that's where you're going to see your strongest competition. Okay, so in the previous slide, it should have been in space B. All right, so if you have niche estimate for species 1 and niche estimate for species 2, in nature, we generally only see partial overlap, because if you see complete overlap, then there's going to be a problem. Okay, but wherever these guys happen to overlap, that's the site where you're going to see the strongest competition for resources. And ultimately, what happens is that tends to lead to species changing so they don't have to compete as much for those resources. Now, bees, on the other hand, happen to have a great relationship with plants, as we talked about last time, as pollinators, okay? So that's a nice little mutualistic relationship that we will discuss later. But what we're going to talk about now is competition. So we'll talk about competitive exclusion principle, resource partitioning, character displacement, and all sorts of other good stuff. Okay, for competition, these are the things you need to know. Write this down. First off, we started you off. It's negative interaction. So what this means, write it down, is that both species have reduced fitness. So a negative interaction means that both species have a reduced fitness. And then number 2, that there's a limiting resource. So seeds, nutrients, space, light, something along those lines. So number 1, negative interaction, both species have a reduced fitness. Number 2, there's a limiting resource. Could be seeds, could be nutrients, space. Okay? Write down for number 3, it can be intraspecific or interspecific, and y'all should know what that means by now. Intra is within species, or inter is between species. Okay? So number 3 is it can be intraspecific or interspecific. Number 4, it can involve direct contact or fighting, but very often competition is much more subtle. Think of if you have any siblings. Okay, if you have any siblings, think about, if you used to argue with them and so forth for limited resources. And then last but not least, number 5, it can be asymmetric. This means that one partner can suffer more than the other. Now I'm going to try and upload a video. If it doesn't work, then what I want you guys to do is to watch the video in the announcement, but I'm hoping it loads properly. Okay, so what you should have noticed in the previous videos is you had 2 different birds who were competing for a nesting box. Okay, so now for this particular slide, you need to go to the PowerPoint, okay, because apparently the figure didn't load. My apologies. But what this figure is meant to illustrate is called the competitive exclusion principle. Okay, so what this competitive exclusion principle means is that if you have 2 species that have identical niches, they cannot coexist. Okay, so what this is actually showing you, go to your PowerPoint again, okay, because it will be there, is there's an experiment where scientists were growing paramecium species. Okay, now if they're grown individually, they will do fine and they will thrive. However, if you happen to rear them together, one species, the paramecium caudatum, was always eliminated. Now the other species, the Aurelia, did suffer, okay, which showed that there was some competition, so it didn't do as well as if it was alone. However, the caudatum was the one that always was eliminated. So what this means is that nature is not going to allow 2 niches to overlap completely, because if that were to happen, one species is always going to be driven out. Okay, so, and that's just what the purpose of this experiment was meant to show, which is actually some pretty cool stuff. Now, the thing I would like you to consider is that competitive exclusion is going to occur when competition is asymmetric and when niches overlap. Okay, in nature, competition is almost always asymmetric. I can't think of an example where it's actually symmetric. So let's read through this. What does it mean? So if you look at the graph on the left, you have fitness low to high, species 1 alone, species 2 alone, then what it looks like if you have species 1 and 2 grown together. Okay, you can see that their competition is asymmetric because the purple species has higher fitness than the green species when they're together. All right. Now, symmetric competition is the graph on the right. Okay, species 1 alone, species 2 alone. If they're grown together, they have the same fitness according to symmetric competition. But again, this almost never happens in nature, and I can't think of an example where it does. Okay, so just realize that it's almost, as far as I can remember, it's almost always been asymmetric, where someone beats out the other, one species beats out the other one. So if you were to graph this in 2-dimensional space, where you have your niches for both of your species and they happen to overlap completely, this might be what it would look like, keeping in mind, though, that ultimately this would lead to one, to change through evolution, because someone's going to get eliminated. So given what we've talked about, if competition is asymmetric and your niches are overlapping completely, your species 1 is your stronger competitor, species 2 is the weaker competitor, that's the one that will be driven to extinction. Okay, so just realize again that, this is ultimately what's going to happen unless somebody can evolve and change. If you take any upper level ecology class from this point on, you have got to be familiar with this experiment. Okay, it's a classic one. So what O'Connell noticed is that barnacle species were distributed in distinct zones. Okay, the thalamus was in the upper tidal zone, and then the semibalanus was in the lower semi-balanus, we can, this is very often referred to, these guys are referred to as just balanus. They happen to be the larger species. Okay, so again, these are barnacles. The tide will go in and out. Okay, and so they seem to be very distinct in where they're found. So the hypotheses you were trying to test is the first hypothesis: the adult thalamus was competitively excluded from the lower intertidal zone by the balanus. The second hypothesis was that the adult thalamus just didn't thrive in the physical conditions of the lower intertidal zone, although that one kind of seemed unlikely. Okay, given the fact that they have to be submerged to be able to feed. Speaking, you have thalamus growing on both sides, and what you're looking for is to see how the balanus will affect the thalamus, okay, how much the competition will impact it. The reason you can't test for A, by the way, is because you don't have a rock with just balanus. All right, in order to test for A, you have to actually do the reverse, okay, but he did not do that, so really all he was testing for was B. But again, this is a classic experiment, and found some interesting information, so it worked really well. All right, guys, so here's a great application question. I want you to draw a figure that would show what the results would look like if hypothesis 1 is supported. Then I want you to draw a second figure to show what the results would look like if hypothesis 2 is supported. Stop lecture, think about this, come up with a figure that you feel would illustrate each of these hypotheses, and when you're ready, go ahead and start lecture. So given this really cool experiment, by the way, okay, this is what they ended up finding. So in the lower intertidal, the semibalanus will overgrow, uplift, and crush the thalamus in order to exclude it from that region, okay? But when the competitor is absent, all right, thalamus does just fine. So what this tells us is that hypothesis 1 must be true. Okay, and so I hope that makes sense. Remember how the experiment is designed. Remember what we talked about in the previous slide and the previous slide before that to remember what's actually being tested. And then this should make sense in light of those that data. So you might be asking yourself, why doesn't the semibalanus exclude thalamus from the upper intertidal? Well, the reality is that the balanus can't handle the upper intertidal. That's where thalamus is able to beat them out. Okay, so that's why they still exist, and so they're eking out a living. They would probably much rather be in the lower intertidal, but when they are, then they get squeezed out. Okay, so they're basically surviving, and their niches are distinct from one another in those areas because that allows them to survive. So basically what this means is that if the niches don't overlap completely, the weaker competitors can use non-overlapping resources, okay? And this leads us to another couple of concepts that are very important, a fundamental niche and a realized niche. You guys should know this, okay? A fundamental niche means this is where this critter would grow if there was nobody else around, okay? A realized niche is where it does actually grow. Okay, and you can see from the previous experiment that this definitely plays a role in the barnacle distribution, okay, because in one area, someone's getting squeezed out, okay, in the other area, someone is not able to colonize it because it goes beyond their physiological capabilities. All right, so make sure that you understand fundamental niche and realize the niche and make sure that it makes sense. So given this information, you might be asking yourself, well, what would the long-term consequences of competition be? And I would say, aha, that is an excellent question. So ultimately what happens is if you have resource partitioning, this is going to lead to evolutionary change in the resource use by coexisting species. Okay, and so one example, a really great example of these are the Anole lizards. Okay, they're found all over Florida. We've told you about them before. They're also known as Izzies. Anytime you go down there, you can kind of see them all over the place. Okay, and there are some that are, native or endemic to those areas, and there are others that are invaders. Okay, and so these guys have to adapt and be able to live in the presence of one another, because again, you can't have them where they completely overlap in niche or someone's going to go extinct. Now, the two species that we just introduced, remember that the carolinensis is the one that is native, okay? And what researchers found is when it occurs on its own, it uses the whole tree, all the way from the ground all the way to the crown, okay? But when the carolinensis and the segrii co-occur, the carolinensis only uses the higher parts of the trees. And because of that, this suggests resource partitioning. And the reason is because perch height seems to influence prey capture. So the hypothesis is that by adding this invader to habitats that only contain carolinensis, this will lead to a shift in their habitat use. Make sure that you can read through that, given this information, and then make sure that this makes sense, okay? Because it has to before we hit the next figure. Now, this study was conducted in the 90s. I can tell you most likely they would not allow an invader to be added these days, okay? But what they did was they experimentally added this invader species to 3 islands, all right? And they left 3 islands as unmanipulated controls. And so one island, by the way, was small, one was medium, and one was large, and then they looked to watch the effect. Now again, read your axis, okay? So we get the carolinensis and the perch height, okay, is on the y-axis, and then the year is on the x-axis. And what you can see is where they happen to add this invader, the carolinensis was found at much higher areas. So once again, suggesting resource partitioning so they didn't have to completely compete with the new introduced species. Now, we said before, the long-term consequences of competition are character displacement, so means change in species traits, and this is what allows co-occurring species to use different resources, okay? So one way these guys adapt to shifting to living in higher ground is to have their feet adapt so they can get better at climbing, okay? And so as you move to the next slide, this will make more sense. Now there's 2 ways these little guys can adapt to living higher in the canopy, okay? So one is to adjust their toe pad area, all right, have larger toe pad area. And the next is the lamellae number. So lamellae, those are those ridges that were on the previous slide that you can see on their feet, okay? So what they did, the researchers did, was they caught these guys both in an area with and without their competitors, okay, and looking at the lamellae number and the toe pad area. And so then they also put them into a common garden. The idea being that they were checking to see if it was a long-term or short-term effect that might happen through phenotypic plasticity. And for those of you future ecologists, go look up the term phenotypic plasticity. It's a good one to know. And if what you find is that the common garden showed that there was some statistical differences, even though they took all of those little guys and they put them in the common place, those that were living with this extra invader species have adapted and changed. So they are living, at the upper levels of the canopy so they don't interfere, okay? So it's not as if this just happens in 1 or 2 generations. They've actually adapted to living in those particular areas, which is actually really cool. Now, if the competitors were to be removed, then they might lose their toe pad area and they might lose their lamellae number and go back to where they were before. However, for right now, this is what the data shows. And this is very strongly suggests resource partitioning as they take advantage of the higher canopy where they can outcompete that invader species. Now it's time for us to talk about mutualisms. And so mutualisms are very cool because ultimately what's going on is a win-win, okay? And so again, pollination is, one way where it's a win-win because the flower is getting pollinated and the bee is getting food. So it's a really great example of this. Now here we have 2 really good examples of mutualisms. We've got mycorrhizae and land plants on the left, and then we have pollinators and those being pollinated on the right. And so these are 2 great examples. The plants, of course, get nutrients and so forth from the mycorrhizae, and the mycorrhizae get a place to live and so forth. So that's nice little mutualism. We've already talked about the example on the right. So it's a nice way, that nature collaborates. Now let's talk about some key points of mutualisms, and you should write this down. And did I mention you should write this down? Because you should totally write this down. So when it comes to mutualism, number one, you need to show that both players benefit. Okay, so a common mistake that some people make is to show that one player benefits without considering the impact on the other species. To truly be a mutualism, it has to be a win-win. Okay. Number two, mutualisms do cost something. Okay, but the benefit outweighs the cost. So number one, to show that both players benefit. Number two, mutualisms do cost something, but the benefit outweighs the cost. Number three, okay, so it is not, nature doesn't do something to benefit the partner species. Okay, so both of them have to be getting something good out of this relationship. And then number four is actually pretty interesting. You can actually have interactions that will change between mutualism and parasitism over time. It just kind of depends on what's going on in nature, what the conditions are, and so forth, and you know, how things are interacting at that particular point in time. Okay, so hopefully you guys have done the reading. Have I mentioned hopefully you've done the reading? And you know exactly what type of organism lives in the nodules shown in this picture. Take a moment, pause lecture, choose your answer, and when you're ready, start up again. The correct answer, by the way, is C. Okay, the rhizobium bacteria. That's who the plant is making a home for, and then the bacteria are helping the plant by getting nitrogen for the plant to use in a usable form. How awesome is that? Okay, the plants are so happy and grateful that they even make little houses for the bacteria. You gotta give them credit for that. Now, these guys, rhizobia, are not the only ones that happen to fix nitrogen. So some other bacteria can. Some archaea can as well. One good example in the ocean of somebody who can fix bacteria, the common name is the sea straw. Okay, and so you can see them bloom over different parts of the oceans, realizing that they are fixing nitrogen and putting it into a form that plants can use. Interestingly enough, when it comes to mycorrhizae and land plants, they have a very extensive relationship. So mycorrhizae fungi will help plants take up phosphate and other nutrients, and the plants will supply the mycorrhizae fungi with carbohydrates like glucose and other sugars. More than 90% of land plants will have association with mycorrhizal fungi. This tells you there's a lot of fungi, okay, that collaborate with land plants. Now, just to tell you a quick story about what happened when I was in grad school, when you're in lab way too late at night and you haven't had enough sleep and you get into stupid arguments with geeky science friends. I worked on spruce trees when I was a grad student, and I thought, you know, get into these arguments with friends over whose study organism is cooler. And my friend was working on fungi, and so we got into this argument one night late at night, and I was like, spruce trees are so much more interesting. You know, they're bigger and taller, and you can see them, and they're just awesome looking. And she was like, whatever, as soon as you start looking at your spruce trees under a microscope, you're going to find that they're covered by fungi. And I was like, not going to happen. And stupid me, I didn't know at the time that she was completely right. And as soon as I took a spruce needle and I stuck it underneath the microscope, I saw they are actually covered in fungi in the roots as well as other parts of the plant. So, piece of advice, when you've not had enough sleep, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you're arguing with your friends, just don't. Because there's lots of times you'll be proven wrong. So something that you should know is that plants do have many microbial mutualists, and so what I want you to do is download the PowerPoint figure of version of this figure, and then go ahead and read through just to realize that microbes help them tolerate the heat, tolerate the cold, do all sorts of other cool things, you know, that things that we never even really realized until somewhat recently. What's even more interesting is that the microbes that are found on the roots of plants actually differ significantly from the microbes that are found in the soil. And what researchers have found is that plants will actually produce certain hormones and so forth on their roots that will attract certain microbes that the plants can then interact with to have that mutualistic relationship. I mean, seriously, how cool is that? The plants actually get to choose their microbes. We can't even do that. Okay, so let's talk about a really cool unexpected mutualism that researchers found not too long ago, okay? But first, let's talk a little bit about aphids. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen aphids before. These guys are a pest in agriculture. They feed on phloem, okay? They also have asexual as well as sexual reproduction. Now, winged females will reproduce sexually, and wingless females reproduce asexually, but it happens really, really fast. In fact, they can reproduce so quickly because clones are often born alive and pregnant. Okay, you can imagine that's really quick offspring. So asexual clones are commonly produced in spring and summer, and sexual reproduction occurs in fall. Now, sexual reproduction results in cold, hardy eggs that will hatch the following spring. So, there are a lot of ideas about what would allow or cause identical clones to either produce wings or remain wingless. And so, initially, researchers were thinking it was crowding, lack of food resources that would stimulate wings, production in new clones. They weren't really sure at first. And so, what they thought what should happen is that, given how fast aphids can reproduce asexually, ultimately they should stop reproducing sexually because of the fitness differences. But the thing to consider is that the winged morph has a really good advantage. It can disperse to new places that are far away from the original population, have new resources to use, new host plants, low competition, and so, there are a lot of potential advantages, as we've talked about in the past, of sexual reproduction. But the question was, what actually causes this? What causes the wings to form? And this is where things get interesting. So after doing some additional experiments, researchers finally discovered that it seemed to be a virus that would actually cause wing formation in aphids, okay? And so they narrowed it down to two different viruses. One was called the rosy apple aphid virus. The other was called the Disaphis plantagenea densovirus. So much fun to pronounce. Anyway, they knew it was one of those two viruses. Okay, so considering this, they had to conduct an experiment where they could figure out, what was actually causing the wings to form. So given this information, think about what type of an experiment you would design to be able to test which of these viruses, if either one, would cause wing formation. So they focused on using clones, okay? And so then they looked at their aphids. They infected some of them with viruses, one virus, the RAV only, the second virus only, both viruses, and then virus-free, and then looked to see who had wings, okay? And so according to their data set, all right, it was not the rosy apple aphid virus. It was the Disaphis plantagenea densovirus, all right, that actually caused wing formation. So this seems to be some sort of mutualism where the virus gets to get carried on to the next generation because it's allowing for sexual reproduction, okay, and it's helping the aphids, and then the aphid populations get to do better because they can fly off and go settle a whole new host. And so you get this really cool mutualism that, researchers didn't even know about until relatively recently at the molecular level. How cool is that, guys? Like a virus is actually benefiting an aphid. That's pretty awesome. Now, when it comes to land plants, mutualisms have been fundamentally important to their evolution. Okay, so plant-pollinator interactions were critical to angiosperm diversification, as we've said this before. Really, really important and allowed plants to really kind of take over and do super well. Okay, so we have the angiosperm flowers shown here. All right, so the female parts, the stigma style, the ovary. Think back to high school or grade school when you guys had to draw a flower. Hey, never knew it would come back and be useful again, unless, of course, you're a plant person like me. The male parts, the anther and the filaments and so forth. And remember that the entire purpose of the petals and so forth and the sepals and all of that is to draw in pollinators, okay? So different flowers. Now, I'm not talking about ones humans have selected for. I'm talking about nature. Nature, certain pollinators prefer certain characteristics out of plants. And so the plants will sort of adjust themselves accordingly, hoping to, draw in those pollinators. So remember, coevolution is the mutual and reciprocal evolutionary influence between two interacting species. Each of the species will exert selective pressure on the other, so they evolve together. Bats by the way, bats are out so far this year, which is pretty awesome. I don't know if you guys are bat fans. I am. From what I've read, bats can eat 3,000 mosquitoes a night. So let's think about that. You go outside, especially at night, especially in Michigan, you stand out there for more than 5 minutes and you get eaten alive by mosquitoes, okay? Bats can eat 3,000 mosquitoes in one night. How awesome is that, all right? Now, just to also give you guys a little background information, because I personally think bats get a bad reputation, especially now, good heavens, those poor guys. Okay, but the reality is that at one point in time, we started to have some tropical diseases that were moving up to Florida, okay, long ago before Florida had been settled so much. And there were a couple of different scientists that didn't know how to get rid of them. What they decided to do was introduce some bat colonies, okay? And the really awesome part about this is when they did, the tropical diseases then disappeared that were carried by mosquitoes because the bats were eating all of the mosquitoes. So anything that eats that many mosquitoes, that parasites, is okay by me. And if you guys want to see them, they're all over the place. You just have to go out at dusk. I walk my dogs at dusk every night to look for my little bat friends. And usually the birds are not active at that point because they're going into hiding for the evening. But that's when the bats come out and do their whole echo sonar thing to attract the insects. No, they don't want to be anywhere near humans. No, they don't want to bother us or anything along those lines. They specifically try to just go after the insects. Anyway, go bats. Okay, so, bats want lighter colored flowers. Hummingbirds, on the other hand, tend to prefer really bright colored plants. Bee balm is a great example down here. And so, each pollinator will drive a selective pressure on their plants, and the plants will respond accordingly. Now, believe it or not, there's even a Madagascar orchid that has a foot-long nectar spur. And Charles Darwin found this particular orchid, and he hypothesized that there would be an insect that would have a proboscis equally as long to match it. Initially, they hadn't found it, but later on they did, showing that he was right, meaning that, every plant has its pollinator. Now, the mutualism idea isn't completely perfect, and there are some examples where you have cheating. Okay, and so orchids are an example where they're the largest angiosperm family. However, about 50% practice what's called deceit pollination, meaning they don't reward their pollinator. And so I'm going to upload a video. If it doesn't upload at this next slide, I will want you guys to watch it. It's David Attenborough again. Sorry, he's awesome. You all know I love David Attenborough. Okay, he's too awesome when it comes to science. And so there's this really cool video on deceit pollination in orchids. It's pretty awesome and impressive. Now, in addition to fungi, there are many different ant species that will have mutualistic relationship with plants as well, and those are called ant plants. So what happens is the ant plants are plant species that provide some sort of reward, like food or shelter for ants. A great example is acacia trees that will provide proteins, nectaries, and so forth that are rich in sugar. And then they provide hollow thorns where the ants can live. And the whole idea is the ants will protect plants from herbivores and plant competitors. So let's say you're an herbivore wandering around looking for a food source. You start munching on a tree. All of a sudden you have a ton of really angry ants coming at you. Most likely you're going to mosey on and try to find something else that doesn't sting so much. So it's a nice little mutualistic relationship. However, like every system, sometimes there are ants who cheat the system, okay? So rather than removing the herbivores from plants, some ants will actually raise other insects like cattle. How crazy is that? They'll take phloem-feeding insects, and those guys will provide the ants with a source of sugary sap, and then the ants will try to take care of them and make sure that they are healthy and so forth. But then the plant, it becomes a negative relationship because it loses all of its phloem for nothing, okay? And this is an example where you might have a mutualism, but then eventually becomes a parasitism because the ants are not protecting the plant anymore. They're focused on their little phloem-feeding cattle. So what I'd like you to realize, based on this figure, is that the relationship between species can change frequently over time. Okay, when the costs and benefits start to shift, your relationship can go from a mutualism to a parasitism as far as the impact on your second species. Okay. All right, if you guys have any questions, let me know. I will talk to you again on Friday. Still grading exams. We'll get them out to you as soon as I possibly can. Believe me, nobody's going to be happier than me to get these exams back to you. Don't forget, show up for the final. You are responsible, of course, for all of that last information, especially because you guys are going to need it to know for your future classes. And I don't want you coming back, thinking that I didn't teach you what you guys needed to know and that you did not get your money's worth out of this class, because I know for a fact you guys are paying a fortune, okay? So please stay with us and keep listening to all the lectures. You got to know the info. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon.